Dennis Schwarz, the lead game designer for Hunt, Showdown, and Total Dreamboat, sat down with Kirk McKean from Good Luck Have Fun, which is a gaming-centric publication. If you already read that interview, I'm probably not going to reveal anything you don't already know, but you can watch this wild little fight at Crematorium. And if this type of discussion is not your thing, no hard feelings, I'll see you in the next one. So, in the interview, Dennis talked about everything from legacy bugs to the Cain skin controversy to free-to-play and even the possibility of a sequel. So let's read through this interview together and see what we can take away from it about the future of Hunt Showdown. The first question in the interview is about audio design and the challenges that arose from creating a game where sound is such a big component of it. And Dennis talks about all the stuff you know, sound traps, gunshots, all that stuff. But he also mentions something that I find pretty interesting. He says the AI in Hunt Showdown isn't the main challenge. Sure, as a new player you will struggle against some, and if they come into a fight at the wrong time they can be unfavorable. I'm sure we've all felt that. But they're not really the main thing. If you were to imagine the game with only the AI, but no players in its current setup, it probably wouldn't be the same sort of tension. So the reason I find this interesting is on home address I get asked about a private PVE Only Mode pretty often. Don't be surprised if I talk about this again in one of those future videos. But I feel like this response is a bit of an insight into maybe why we haven't seen a PVE Only mode yet. The AI really isn't the main challenge in Hunt, and the trials have a horde-like element where the AI enemies just keep spawning until the trial is over, but I'm not sure that as a cooperative PvE mode, the horde spawning alone has the sort of gaming longevity that people hope it does. I often see requests for a sort of Nazi zombies light, and I think the fun aspects of Call of Duty's horde mode extend beyond just the endless waves of AI. So, again, like I said, I'll probably talk about this again in a future home address video, but this section is just interesting into the possibility of why we haven't seen a PvE only mode. It might be that something like that needs more resources to develop into something truly hunt worthy. And then the next question talks about the rendering bug that was fixed in the most recent update. If you weren't aware, somehow Hunt used to have this rendering bug where windows and doors would only spawn if players had entered the area, which meant you could use the windows and doors in a compound to determine if an enemy team had been through or spawned nearby. And thankfully the bug was fixed for the most part in the last update. Now I bring this up because the next section where the interviewer says something that I think we all felt, that it was a loading/memory constraint. And Dennis says, we actually found out there was a bit more to it when it comes to how the doors and windows and logic entities are being populated. It shouldn't matter that another player was there because it should be a completely local effect, right? Your proximity to a window should decide whether you see the window or not, but that wasn't the case. And so this is interesting to me for a few reasons. For the longest time, I assumed this bug was just a fact of the game. The way Dennis talks about it says to me that it took some real research to find a solution. This wasn't just a hidden checkbox in the CryEngine, but a re-understanding of how CryEngine was utilizing memory. And like he says later in his answer, it's more about memory efficiency. This stands out to me because it shows me that the dev team is still doing the development work. They are still going in on an engine level and looking for solutions to legacy bugs and fixing things that seemed impossible beforehand. I know that sounds obvious to some people, but I read a lot of opinions about Hunt and the dev team, whether it's in my own comment section or over on the subreddit. And it feels like some people think there is like a skeleton crew of Crytek just like making PNGs for weapon skins and dragging those into the game. Which obviously isn't true because we know you can't drag and drop in Hunt. Haha. But jokes aside, those types of issues like the menu and other in-game systems like lighting and weather could be iterated and improved upon. I'm not saying Crytek is adding rain or anything, but I am saying they are still developing the game in more fundamental ways than just tweaking weapon statistics, and the things we assume are impossible or resolute for Hunt are perhaps closer to a gray area than we understand. Which leads us to the next section where the interviewer asks, What are some things you can't fix or change because of choices made during pre-production? And Dennis goes on to explain that the crosshair being off-center in Hunt Showdown was one of those early choices that seemed to make sense at the time, but now that they've gotten so much feedback about it, it's kind of a gray area. He says, if we wanted to change that moving forward, which maybe we'll still do, we'll give the option. It's just one of those things that sounds easy, but has all these knock-on effects. All of a sudden the weapon isn't aligned anymore, and you would need to change all of that. And he continues, so what I'm saying, sometimes you are just committed to certain decisions, and in this case, they become costly if you want to change them in the future. And to me, there isn't a huge amount to say about this. I think Dennis talks about it well, but I think it's worth understanding that things can be fixed and it just takes resources. Also, as someone pointed out when I first shared this article, this is perhaps one of the first times when a developer has publicly acknowledged the crosshair being off-center is open to future adjustment where the player could choose which they prefer. And 4 years in, I think that we are seeing that a lot of player frustration comes from some of these early decisions the developers made. Again, not to harp on it, but like the menu UI. Of course, after all this time, we can say it should have been different, but I feel like that's just a failure of understanding on our part as the players. It's very difficult to foresee all the future challenges of such a large public-facing project, and I hope that doesn't sound apologistic or make me like a Crytek shill or something. But I think gamers, quote-unquote, as a whole, can go into this hobby with a bit more compassion for the development team and just trying to understand how long these projects are in scope and how early decisions can change their outcomes. Which also leads us to the crouch bug. Kirk says, is that where the crouch bug comes from, where the player's head is in a different position depending on what weapon they're using? Parentheses, sometimes this exposes them to fire even when they appear to be in cover from their perspective. And Dennis attributes this to sloppiness. He says, as you do new weapons, you use the foundations of existing weapons. So if you have an inconsistency, maybe it's just one weapon at first without anyone really noticing, it can just spread across multiple weapons as it's being used for new foundations. And as someone who just recently made my own video templates to keep some sort of consistency in quality, I totally get not catching this sooner. Sometimes these sort of quality consistency bugs just kind of slip through, which if you watch through like the totality of the HomeReel channel, you'll notice the audio is just all over the place, and I've been trying to slowly, incrementally, normalize that across the board. And from the crouch bug, they go on to talk about the left peek advantage, where you expose less of your body if you peek a corner using your left side instead of your right. If you didn't know that, well, there you go, free strat. And Dennis goes on to explain why they haven't corrected it. He says, it's mostly a technical issue with the rig and stuff like how the camera is positioned and with the leaning animation. It just comes naturally as a consequence of how it's been set up, and we just need to streamline a little bit to make sure it's fair. So overall, I think they've done a good job at acknowledging that these kind of bugs or gimmicky advantages exist in the game, and I'm hopeful that like with the window and door rendering thing, they will slowly go into the game and maybe correct these things, though I imagine with the crosshair and the left leaning advantage that will take time. And then Kirk goes on to say, you mentioned some of those tactics people use to stay invisible, and one of the things that has come up in meta conversations is the Cain skin. Is he supposed to be so camouflaged? And Dennis says to this that Cain has proven himself to be a challenge primarily because he is dirty. If you think about camouflage techniques and the psychology behind them, like how disruptive patterns can allow you to miss certain things in the environment, Cain is a prime example of how it works very well because it dissolves the silhouette. And so we want to go back to him as well. Cain was a bit of an accident for us because really we didn't expect him to work that well. And I would just add on to this that in a recent dev stream they mentioned that the feedback around Cain has changed the way they consider future legendary skins, like with the Devil's Advocate having a bright red mask. But he goes on to explain that they don't want to change Cain too much because the people that paid for him paid for a certain look. It's about increasing visibility without altering the skin completely. And then they go into a conversation about consoles. Kirk says, on console you sometimes get thrown into an empty lobby. Is player count an issue on console? And although the article mentions that there are 3.5 million unique players, that's not concurrent players, but unique players, most of those are on PC, and Dennis says that the console queue times being so slow is just a result of the smaller player base on console. And so talking about these player numbers, obviously it goes to how to increase those player numbers. Kirk says, have you ever considered going free to play to bump that player count up? And Dennis responds, I honestly can't talk about that, but I mean free to play is a model that's out there. Games have successfully done that, but whether it's a good fit for us or not, I can't say at this moment. And for me, that is a totally non-committal answer and not at all an indication that they are considering going free to play. I think there is some sort of internal review going on about monetization in the game, which is why we have seen higher blood bond prices and more ways to spend blood bonds like Jerry's rewards. And I think the blood bond system is a good example of what we mentioned earlier in the video. The generous amounts of blood bonds that were awarded in the beginning of Hunt's life cycle is the result of earlier decisions that don't necessarily align with the needs of the present. And then from there, they also talk about next-gen upgrades for the Xbox Series consoles and the PS5. Those platforms already had their frames up to 60 FPS, and honestly, I played on the Series X recently, and my horrible aiming aside, it ran pretty well. I talked about the console version in a different video. I know the Series X experience is not the same as the Xbox One and the PS4, and I hope you guys continue to receive improvement if you are on those platforms. But I imagine there are many things that are hard locked because of hardware restraints. Even when those consoles came out, they were already kind of bottom of the barrel for 1080p gaming, and so now they've just lagged too far behind for the sort of breakthrough that I think a lot of console players are hoping for. And one of the most exciting questions for me, Kirk says, do you have any plans for a fourth map? And I've already read Dennis's answer in another video, but I'll read it again, it's fine. Dennis says, we just released one half a year ago. Maps take time. I'm pretty sure there will be more map content in the future, but when and how, it's a bit early. Can't expect a new map every half a year. And like I said earlier, whether that is a new map or remixes of the current maps, no one knows. Maybe new times of day or something. I don't know. But they do talk about why night and fog maps got reduced because statistically, players would just leave if those maps didn't work well for their loadout or play environment. And night maps specifically were an issue that was exacerbated by not being able to choose your contract. Earlier in Hunt's life cycle, you could pick between like 1 or 2 contracts, like 2 bounties on a day map or 1 bounty on a night map. And Dennis said that they do want to have a replacement for that contract option eventually, but there's nothing really solid as a replacement yet. And at last, the final question. I know you've said you enjoyed working on this for quite some time, but would you enjoy working on a sequel as well? And I will just read Dennis's reply because I think it warrants it. Dennis says, eventually. Hunt is the closest thing I have to a child. I'm really invested in this game. I'm really happy how it turned out. Having a chance to work on this since the beginning and shaping it, I'm not getting bored of this. I play this a lot in my free time as well, and Hunt is just a very strong part of my daily activities. As such, whatever allows me to continue working on this game in the future, sure, great, I'll take it. Maybe eventually a sequel, but then again, I think we still have a lot of things to show. So, a sequel eventually, maybe. That's not necessarily official confirmation, but the desire of the lead designer. I think that holds some weight, and I imagine the development team already has a large wish list in case that sequel does come around. So, any huge community requests like dynamic weather events may be in the Hunt universe one day. And in addition to this, I already talked about the Hunt Showdown live action series being produced on Binge, so maybe that will open the door for more future content. So, small transition away from questions, we can talk about some of my biggest takeaways from this article, and you can let me know what you got from it too in the comments. My biggest takeaways from this interview is that Crytek is still working on all aspects of the game. It's not just skins, it's not just adding a catalog from Forgotten Weapons. They are trying to make the game the best it can be, but it sounds like they are being sandbagged by limitations in resources, that is money and manpower, and the decisions they made for the game early on in its development. And that's just the reality of the project. The reason I wanted to talk about this interview, late as I may be, is similar to the reason I've been doing the Home Address series. I feel like the Hunt community, as an entity separate from the game, should strive to lower the toxicity in the room. Every time the developers announce a new change or tweak, there is a wave of vitriol that comes with it, and it just kind of blows my mind. So, take this next paragraph with a pinch of salt. I am literally just some guy on the internet, not paid by Crytek at all, not a partner, etc., etc. I have no extra knowledge of the future plans for Crytek and Hunt Showdown other than what I just read. But the priorities for a project change over time. I think this year we will see a new focus on monetization of Hunt Showdown, and I'm a bit worried that when those changes happen, assuming I am right about that, I may not be, but I'm worried that when those changes happen, there will be a vocal minority raising hell about exorbitant cosmetic prices and incompetent devs and blah blah blah. And I think for the health of the game, this game we all love, it is important to prevent this type of toxicity from spreading and hijacking what is otherwise a really great community about a really great game supported by a really great dev team. So, I don't normally do a call to action for these things, but next time you see a change you don't like, or someone sharing an opinion about the game that you disagree with, maybe, you could interact with that person with a bit of courtesy and compassion. Whether it's a console player asking for texture improvements, or a new guy asking for the Aloft Romero for the 100th time, or a game developer explaining why the game needs to make more revenue, the future of Hunt Showdown can be a bright one if the community can break out of this everlasting, rigid, and kind of conservative mindset. And I don't mean conservative politically, I mean as in afraid of change. Anyway, that's it for me, guys. Sorry this is such a long video, but I've just had a lot of that stuff on my mind for a while now. So, what possibility are you most excited for? A new map? Selectable contracts? Let me know in the comments, and try to be nice to each other. Until the next one, goodbye.